Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Florence. Andiamo avanti.
Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast. This show has taken us through some very interesting moments in the history of the Renaissance in Italy, sometimes very hyper-focused, sometimes quite general. Our third season was brief. It contained an exciting cast of interviewees. After 45 episodes, wow, right? 45. It's time to launch what I am calling our fourth season by stepping back in time a bit and taking a much closer look at the early Renaissance. What are we talking about here? As you all know, the term Renaissance is loose and there is no concrete consensus as to what those dates are. We roughly say it begins in 1400 and look at artists and thinkers before that moment as Proto-Renaissance. All this is to say that we should be loose and malleable with our application of these terms, especially in these transitional moments, 1400. It's not as if one day everything changed, right? There are concurrent styles, varieties of thought that are coexisting at the same time that can often contradict each other. And frankly, it's a little too convenient to say the turn of the century, the year 1400 is when the Renaissance started. It's just a rough date. So far on the show, we've talked about some of these figures from the early Renaissance, like Filippo Brunelleschi, the architect of the Dome in Florence, his rival, Lorenzo Ghiberti, who I hope to give more attention to. We gave some to Donatello and looked at painters like Gentile da Fabriano, Benozzo Gozzoli, as well as Jacopo Bellini in our very, very short treatment of early Renaissance Venice. Then, of course, we talked about Dante, who is in every way a medieval poet, but one that cannot be left out of the history of the Renaissance. All of this is to say, thus far, this podcast, I believe, is inadequately treated some of the most important moments of the early Renaissance. And what that does is leaves a slew of additional historical figures, artists, and beyond artists to look at. I'm thinking Giotto, who we'll look at today, Fra Angelico, Filippo Lippi, Piero della Francesca, Masaccio we'll talk about. If we're talking about architecture, Michelozzo and Alberti, sculptors like Pisanello, Desiderio da Settignano, Mino da Fiesole, and as far as sculptors go, I want to talk a lot more about Donatello. And that's in addition to a large group of writers, politicians, historical moments, although you guys know damn well that we are mainly focused on the history of art and society in this podcast. While the idea that the Renaissance even happened, is being scrutinized in some academic circles, I am a staunch defender that there was a radical culture change in Italy that began roughly around the turn of the century between the 13 and 1400s. Part of the denial lies in the fact that the Renaissance is easily summed up as the rebirth of classical antiquity. Medieval history shows that major cultural shifts towards antique revival happened several times before it happened in Renaissance Italy, and that is most notably under Charlemagne. That's 8th and 9th centuries, and that period is known as the Carolingian Renaissance. So Charlemagne was coronated Holy Roman Emperor, worked his public image in the likeness of Roman emperors from the past, and he looked at Roman art, revived it in the architectural and art projects of his political and propaganda regime of re-envisioning himself as a Roman emperor. This was happening in the 8th and 9th centuries, and his court was in Aachen in modern-day Germany. And then you have the 12th century Renaissance that coincided with the French Gothic period, which saw an increased interest in Latin texts, scientific processes, Greek philosophy, among many other things that we liken to the Florentine Renaissance. This was happening in a somewhat lighter way in the 12th century. And what I'm saying is that classical revival is not unique to 15th century Italy, but the reception of it was widespread due to the influx of materials such as texts and art objects. digging up Roman sculptures, right? Expanded knowledge of antiquity and the proximity to Rome itself also amplified the effects of classical revival in Italy. And by Italy, of course, I mean the Italian peninsula, since Italy was not unified until 1861 as a country, right? So we're not talking Italy the country, we're talking Italy the geographical place. Absolutely central to the way that the Renaissance developed in Italy was the cultural impact of humanism. That's with a capital H, or the decentering of the divine in favor of the importance of individual human intellect, creativity, and expression. There are many factors for us to work through to get to how this cultural revolution occurred, but it is different than how it occurred in Carolingian Franco-Germany and in the 12th century. So although I do talk about this already in great detail in other episodes, I want to take us through the trajectory of how this developed in literature, and I'm going to relate that to visual culture. Dante Alighieri, his Commedia, came out in 1321. It was the year that Dante died. It came out just before his death. His work centralized vernacular language, his Florentine language, his Florentine way of speaking, which is actually the base of modern standardized Italian because of Dante. So slightly younger than Dante was another poet, Francesco Petrarch, who was an absolute proponent of what he called the Latin of Cicero, right? That is classical Latin of Republican era ancient Rome, which is right before the empire, for those of you who don't know your Roman history. So the Latin of Cicero, rather than his contemporary Latin, which had changed over the course of the Middle Ages into what is often referred to as ecclesiastical Latin, Latin of the church, okay? So indeed it was Petrarch who famously degenerated the Middle Ages in his writings, right? He wanted to elevate his own historical moment of classical literary revival with humanistic thought. Okay, so Petrarch's the guy that really painted the image of the Middle Ages that we still have today, that it didn't actually have its own renaissances, cultural innovation, and this variety of change, which ultimately sets up the Italian Renaissance. So our modern and inaccurate term, the Dark Ages, does come from Petrarch, who wrote, and I'm quoting here, "Amidst the errors there shone forth men of genius, no less keen were their eyes, although they were surrounded by darkness and dense gloom." Right? He's defending the thinkers who are stuck in the period before his, that are surrounded by darkness and dense gloom. That is the Christian period after the decline of antiquity. Think about this, folks. Very important here. For Petrarch, who was a prolific and famous poet in his lifetime, very influential in his lifetime. I don't know, he was a George R. Martin or Chomsky. I don't know. He refers to the gloom of the post-pagan Christian world. He had direct contrast to his contemporary period, or the period right before his, according to him, of the condemnation of the pagan past. He's celebrating it and saying the rise of Christianity is a period of gloom and darkness, even though he was a devout Christian. He's talking about the cultural structures for art and literature. The third component of this history is the onset of the Black Death, right, which struck Europe in the last years of the 1340s, also known as the bubonic plague, Black Death, same thing. This was a pandemic that wiped out somewhere between a third, probably closer to a third, but up to a half of Europe's entire population, completely reshaping the social and religious structure throughout the entire continent. You have to imagine this awful moment in history where most people died or experienced most people that they know dying. We just lived through COVID, which was a horrible situation, but the Black Death is an absolute devastation to much of like Eurasia into Africa.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show.
Frankly, there is no historical conclusion as to whether or not the Black Death had any direct effects on the progression of humanist thought. They don't write about it. But on one hand, the plague was perceived as either punishment from God, or they actually blamed it on the Jewish population. However, did such brutal devastation sow seeds of doubt in the religious structures as to dislodge the absolute trust of divinity? Allow a moment for the individual human to shine through, especially in the face of seemingly inescapable, incurable death? I would say there's a parallel. Just as I'm sure the effects of COVID will shape our societies for years to come, and we can probably already see some of those changes now. Dante, Petrarch, the Black Death, the third of the so-called Tre Corone, the three-crowned Tuscan poets, Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Giovanni Boccaccio. He was a renowned humanist. He was a friend of Petrarch. He was a Dantista, and he wrote his seminal text, the Decameron, which takes place during the plague years, right? 13, 48, 49, and 50. And it tells a series of bawdy and often raunchy morality stories through the frame of a group of young nobles who have fled to the countryside to escape the devastation of the plague in Florence. He's lived through the plague, and he's writing through the plague. And indeed, although if this text, the Decameron, only addresses the comfort of escape for who is really the upper class, those who have villas in the countryside they can escape to, the text embodies a sense of humor, fun, and of individualistic expression in the face of absolute horror. In the city, everyone is dying. No one is safe. This kind of bawdy humor is happening where the clerics would expect prayer and devotion to stem the wrath of God. Well, that's not what Boccaccio is focused on, right? So as a follower of Petrarch and Dante, as a survivor of the Black Death, Boccaccio's work becomes entirely influential to the mode of thought in learned circles in Tuscany after the Black Death passes, right? He's paving the way for the widespread proliferation of humanistic thought by the early 1400s in Florence, but also in England, because his text is ultimately going to influence Chaucer, who's going to write his Canterbury Tales that are loosely related to Boccaccio's Decameron. Of course, cultural movements tend to move across medium, and if we dial back our history clock to Dante's era, late 1200s into 1300s, we have to address the work and innovation of the painter Giotto da Bandone, who will be the absolute model for the early Renaissance painters in Florence. And we're talking about Giotto. He was quick to rise in fame. He was famous in his lifetime too. He's mentioned by Dante in his Purgatorio as having surpassed his master Cimabue, the great innovator of Duecento painting, 1200s. 15th century painter Cimabue. So Giotto also gets a story in Boccaccio's Decameron. He's in it, but it only really talks about how ugly he was. Although this shows a testament to Giotto's fame by Boccaccio's period to get to get a whole story dedicated to him in the Decameron. What made Giotto so innovative, especially compared to Cimabue? If Dante's noting that Giotto so magnificently surpassed Cimabue, we have to take a look at their works side by side. Okay, so Giotto's departing from Cimabue is clearly demonstrated in two works that are in the Uffizi Gallery. In fact, they actually put them next to each other so that you can see this yourself. So if you go to the Uffizi, most of us sort of walk through the medieval hyper gold Madonnas, but there really is a lot of nuance to these figures. So, of course, I'm gonna post these images. But if you're sitting around listening, you should pull up Cimabue's Santa Trinita Maesta, which was painted in the end of the 1280s. That is the Santa Trinita Maesta in the Uffizi Gallery. What do we have here? A Madonna enthroned, very much indebted to the Byzantine tradition. I'm talking about the gold background, the Madonna pointing to the Christ child who raises a hand in blessing is directly out of Byzantine iconography. The Madonna, hierarchy of scale. She is the biggest figure. These are not naturalistically rendered. The figures stack on top of each other when you look at the angels to the left and the right, and the saints who sit below the throne in this sort of crypt that resembles some late medieval churches in Italy. Cimabue is attempting spatial reconstruction, attempting to put the Madonna set back in the throne, but it is indebted to Gothic painting that has what are called these Gothic folds that are highlighted by scratching in gold. They're like V-shaped in between her knees. And the spatial configuration isn't actually convincing. It's only trying to be, but it doesn't necessarily succeed on that front. But it is trying to be, which shows that Cimabue is innovative. It's going to take Giotto to take those innovations to the next level. If we look at an altarpiece by Giotto known as the Ognissanti Madonna from 1310, also in the Uffizi, we see how Giotto takes Cimabue's initial innovations and expands them. It's the same shape. It's a large altarpiece featuring a Madonna and Child enthroned in the middle, surrounded by angels on some sort of architectural setting. Background is completely gold. We are still indebted to that Byzantine heritage, except things have changed slightly. What's going on here? There is no perspective, linear perspective, scientific or mathematical linear perspective yet, but Giotto is trying to convince you of deeper space. How does he do that? He does that by doing a sort of eyeballing the depth of the throne, by using sort of like the rendering of 3D shapes. What is Giotto's grand innovation? Something known as chiaroscuro, light and shade. Modeling of the figures. That means if you are looking at these together, yes, look at Cimabue's Madonna who has this slight shadow under her chin, but then look at it in Giotto's, whose shadow becomes contrasted with her pale flesh, modeling under the eyes, modeling around the neck. Her hand rests on her child's leg. He is going for naturalism over standardized iconography, right? The Christ child is still a little George Costanza, but that's okay. He's raising his hand in blessing. He too is modeled. Their expressions are more realistic, but still divine. And what is going on with the scale? He's maintained Cimabue's and the earlier scale of hierarchy for more holy figures. She is larger, she is enthroned. That's all okay. We are in the Proto-Renaissance, or we are in the Middle Ages. This is medieval art, not Renaissance art. She's allowed to be bigger. And what have you. Pay attention to this, folks. It's very important. If you look at Cimabue's Madonna, the angels stack on top of each other. There is a very, very small amount of overlap between the gold of their halos. All of their faces are fully visible, and they stack all the way up to the top of the frame. Not Giotto. He has invented some sort of imagined horizon line where these figures could not possibly stand near the Madonna, and their halos cut off each other's faces. So instead of being on top of each other, they are behind each other, recessing in space. Highly unusual to cut off figures' faces in these types of artworks, and Giotto is doing that. He's doing it by inventing space. He has his modeling, which creates 3D form, and look at the folds of the drapery. Look at the Madonna's dark, dark blue outside that gets lighter and lighter towards the knees because the lighter colors are going to project her knees forward. Okay? She has a lap. She is sitting on a throne that is pushed back into space. Although it is not mathematically rendered, it is a major innovation in altarpieces or any type of painting. We're in the 1300s, the 1310s. that is going to ultimately inspire the entire next generation of artists. I want to reiterate that these two paintings, Cimabue's Maestà and Giotto's Ognissanti Madonna, are by and large late Italian medieval paintings. Giotto is the spark of naturalism, taking bold steps towards crafting his own individualistic artistic expression and breaking from the mold of standardized representation, in the very same way that Dante, Boccaccio, and Petrarch were doing with their literary excursions, right? The literary works. I want to likewise reinforce that while these are Florentine works, Giotto's most essential masterworks are in Padua, near Venice, where he attracted the attention of the prominent banker Enrico Scrovegni to paint his palace chapel, now known as either the Arena Chapel or the Scrovegni Chapel. This was also painted in the early 1300s, and it must be seen on your travels through Veneto, as it contains dozens of scenes from the life of Christ, images of the vices and the virtues, a magnificent Last Judgment, where Giotto's hell comes directly from Dante's Inferno, where you have the devil with three mouths chomping on these poor sinners. And these are works that are, in the Scrovegni Chapel, completely breaking away from the Byzantine-like altarpiece, but they're employing complete mastery of the early style of modeling chiaroscuro and spatial composition. This is realized ultimately in the Arena Chapel. But Lawrence, you said humanism was a move away from the divine, but all you're talking about is religious painting. Dear listeners, yes, I am. It certainly does not go away, religious painting. We have to keep in mind that Giotto's innovation of cultural standards becomes an expression of him, is in the expression of himself as an artist, moving away from standardized modes of painting. He's no longer crafting altarpieces, he's innovating their expression. Renaissance humanism and classical revival are always in reconciliation with the variety of Christian values in the period rather than the denial of them. We rarely get to a point where artists and thinkers are blatantly rejecting merits of Christianity. Giotto paves the way for the visual experimentation that will be developed by Lorenzo Monaco and Fra Angelico, which is eventually morphing into the monumental mythological scenes of Botticelli and Luca Signorelli in the court of Lorenzo the Magnificent, and all the way into the massive commissions of these gigantic frescoed mythological scenes in the 16th century in Rome and in northern Italy. This is all starting here with these steps away from tradition. Very much in the same way that later 15th century poets and writers would emulate and expand upon Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, such as my favorite Angelo Poliziano, Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, are all looking back at these writers. And this is all occurring under the political umbrella that is a sovereign republican Florence. Right? Florence was not a monarchy, and so it saw itself as emblem of civic pride. The merchant class, the guilds, they were accumulating excessive amounts of wealth, which then created a city of prosperity, especially after the Black Death, once people started to rebound. Of course, not everyone was prosperous. There were poor people. The cultural movers were. So, in a somewhat democratic space, without some divine ruler, if we think of Charlemagne again in the 8th and 9th century, the Holy Roman Emperor positioned himself through Roman revival as an extension of divine rule. Then classical rebirth in the Florentine Renaissance focused on the individuals, and by this I mean only men, and their ability to participate in government and civil affairs, as well as create literary and artistic works that reflected individualistic innovation. And to recall the Black Death, this may have had something to do with the collective personal attitudes towards the actual presence of the divine in the aftermath of the devastation of the plague. Okay, there you have it. Do you see how the literary movements linked to the visual culture, to the political structure, to civic pride, and how that's all tied together by the possible effects of natural devastation through the Black Death, which sets the early Italian Renaissance apart from these earlier medieval Renaissances, and how that enables paths for later thinkers like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo. Okay, even though I do want to stress that the greatness of the early Renaissance masters stands alone without needing to credit them for those who follow them and do better things. That's not really what we're talking about here, but there is a sort of developmental trajectory. So in the upcoming episodes, we are going to be looking at these great masters of the early Renaissance. I know this was a lot of review, but it was necessary to set the stage for what's coming ahead, and that is a much closer look at the many megaliths of the first half of the Quattrocento, that is 15th century Italy. I hope you are all as excited as I am. Thank you so much for listening, and stay tuned for more of the Italian Renaissance podcast. Until next time, arrivederci.